The mahogany doors of the St. Regis ballroom stood like guards protecting what should have been the happiest moment of 300 lives. Instead, they would become witnesses to a confession that would destroy everything: fortunes, futures, and the fragile threads that bind human hearts together. Daniel Rothschild stood at the altar, his $30,000 Tom Ford tuxedo perfect, his stance confident, his entire life about to implode in front of New York's most powerful people. The federal judge had just spoken those ancient words that usually meant nothing. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence stretched. 200 guests held their breath in that theatrical way wedding guests do, knowing no one ever actually speaks up, until Daniel turned from the altar to face them all. "I do," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "I have a reason why this wedding shouldn't happen." In the third row, a woman in a simple black dress went pale. Rebecca Moreno, Becca to those who knew her 7 years ago, gripped her clutch so hard her knuckles turned white. She'd known this was a mistake, coming here, watching him marry someone else. But she'd never imagined this. What could make a billionaire destroy his own wedding in front of everyone who mattered? Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been to a wedding where you knew the couple was making a mistake? Where you could feel disaster hanging in the air like expensive perfume? Where every smile looked forced and every "I love you" sounded rehearsed? Drop a comment if you've witnessed wedding drama, but I guarantee it was nothing like what happened at the St. Regis that September afternoon. Because this wasn't just a wedding falling apart. This was 3 lives choosing destruction over deception, and the fallout would cost billions. Let me tell you about the 3 people whose lives were about to shatter in front of Manhattan's elite. Daniel Rothschild was everything New York's upper class aspired to be. 38 years old, devastating to look at, and worth $3.2 billion from his pharmaceutical empire, Rothschild Biotech. His rise from a middle-class background in Queens to the penthouse suites of Central Park West was the stuff of Harvard Business School case studies, the kind of man who appeared on Forbes covers and dated supermodels, who donated millions to charity while ruthlessly destroying competitors. He'd built his empire on one revolutionary cancer treatment that had saved thousands of lives. But behind all that success, Daniel carried a secret that had been eating at him for 7 years, a love he'd never truly released. The woman walking down that aisle toward him, before he decided to detonate his entire life, was not just any bride. She was perfection wrapped in Vera Wang and diamonds. Her name was Victoria Ashford, daughter of real estate mogul Anthony Ashford, whose buildings scraped the Manhattan sky and whose influence reached into every boardroom that mattered. At 32, she was everything a billionaire's wife should be: Harvard law graduate, philanthropist, possessed of the kind of beauty that made photographers weep with joy. Their union had been orchestrated over 18 months of courtship that played out in society pages and Instagram stories followed by millions. The Ashford-Rothschild merger, as the financial press called it, would create a dynasty worth over $8 billion. But Victoria had her own secrets, ones that would soon turn this wedding into the most explosive social disaster New York had ever witnessed. And then there was Rebecca Moreno, the woman in the third row who shouldn't have been there at all. She'd received her invitation 6 weeks earlier, delivered by courier to her Brooklyn apartment in an envelope so expensive she'd been afraid to open it. Inside, Daniel's handwriting, those precise strokes she'd recognize anywhere, had simply said, "You deserve to know I'm moving on. Please come, D." 7 years earlier, Becca had been everything Victoria wasn't. Spontaneous where Victoria was calculated. Warm where Victoria was polished. Real where Victoria was performance. She'd been a nurse at Mount Sinai, pulling double shifts to pay off student loans while sending money home to her family in the Bronx. She'd met Daniel when he was still building his company in a converted warehouse in Long Island City, working 18-hour days and living on takeout and dreams. Now she sat among 200 of New York's most powerful people, Investment bankers, federal judges, senators, celebrities, all about to witness something none of them would ever forget. The kind of story they'd whisper about at dinner parties for decades. The day Daniel Rothschild chose truth over comfort and paid the ultimate price. To understand why Daniel Rothschild was about to destroy his $3 million wedding, you need to know about the woman he'd lost 7 years earlier. The one sitting in row 3, trying to disappear into her chair. Daniel met Rebecca Moreno in 2011, back when Rothschild Biotech was just 3 employees working out of a converted warehouse in Long Island City. He'd been trying to perfect a revolutionary cancer treatment, burning through his savings and whatever funding he could scrape together. She was working night shifts at Mount Sinai's oncology ward, making $65,000 a year and sending half of it home to help her mother keep their Bronx apartment. They met, of all places, in a hospital cafeteria at 3 a.m. Daniel had been there visiting a trial patient who'd taken a bad turn. Becca was on hour 14 of a 16-hour shift. He was wearing a wrinkled suit that had seen better days. She was in scrubs stained with coffee and exhaustion. He'd forgotten his wallet. She bought him a terrible turkey sandwich and lukewarm coffee, and somehow they talked until sunrise. "You look like someone who hasn't slept in a week," she'd said, not recognizing him as the pharmaceutical entrepreneur the business pages were starting to notice. "Try a month," he'd replied, and when he smiled, she saw past the exhaustion to something real, something hungry for more than just success. For 3 years they were inseparable. Becca became his anchor in a world that was rapidly expanding beyond his control. When his first clinical trial failed and 2 patients died, she held him while he sobbed in their tiny Hell's Kitchen apartment, convinced he was a killer, not a savior. When the FDA rejected his application twice, she was the one who pushed him to try again, to adjust the formula, to believe that saving lives was worth any amount of failure. She was there the night everything changed, when patient number 37, a 6-year-old girl named Lucy with stage 4 leukemia, went into complete remission. The treatment worked. Daniel called Becca from the hospital, crying so hard he couldn't speak. She ran 20 blocks in the rain to reach him, and they stood in that hospital lobby, soaking wet, holding each other while nurses and doctors applauded around them. Within 6 months, Rothschild Biotech was worth $500 million. Within a year, $2 billion. The same people who'd laughed at Daniel's warehouse laboratory were now begging for meetings. He moved from Hell's Kitchen to a Central Park West penthouse. He traded his beat-up Honda for a Bentley. He went from nobody to somebody so fast it gave everyone whiplash. Everyone except Becca. She stayed exactly who she was, a nurse who cared more about her patients than parties, who wore Target dresses to galas where other women dripped designer labels, who looked at Daniel like he was still that exhausted man in the hospital cafeteria, not the billionaire everyone wanted a piece of. But success has a way of demanding sacrifices, especially in Manhattan's elite circles. The beginning of the end came when Daniel's mother, Eleanor, entered the picture. She'd abandoned Daniel and his father when Daniel was 12, running off with a tennis instructor. But when Daniel's father died of cancer, the very disease Daniel would later learn to fight, Eleanor had somehow landed on her feet, marrying Harrison Bradley, old money from Connecticut. Now she was back, drawn by her son's billions like a moth to gold flame. "She's lovely, darling," Eleanor said about Becca over tea at the plaza, her smile sharp as winter glass. But lovely doesn't open doors. Lovely doesn't secure dynasties. The Ashfords have been trying to set you up with their daughter for months. That's a union that makes sense. Daniel should have walked out, should have chosen Becca right there. Instead, he sat frozen, letting his mother plant seeds of doubt that would grow into the destruction of everything real in his life. The final break came on a rain-soaked Thursday in March, 7 years before the wedding disaster. Daniel had just closed a $500 million funding round with international investors. The celebration was at the Rainbow Room, 65 floors above Manhattan, the city lights stretching out like promises of endless possibility. Becca arrived straight from a 12-hour shift, still in her scrubs under her coat, to find Daniel surrounded by people who looked at her like she'd wandered in from another planet. Billion-dollar fund managers, Swiss pharmaceutical executives, American dynasties dating back to the Mayflower. And there was Eleanor, whispering in her son's ear, while Victoria Ashford, in a $20,000 dress, laughed at something Daniel said, her hand on his arm. That night, in their Tribeca apartment, Daniel spoke words that would haunt him forever. "This isn't working, Becca. We're from different worlds. You deserve someone who—" "Who what?" she'd interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "Who loves me? Because that's you, Daniel. Or at least it was." "Love isn't enough," he'd said, 3 words that would replay in his mind every single day for the next 7 years. "Not in my world." She moved out the next morning. No dramatic scenes, no begging. Becca had too much dignity for that. She simply packed her things, left the engagement ring he'd bought but never gave her in the drawer where she'd accidentally found it 3 months earlier, and vanished from his life. She didn't take anything he'd bought her, not the jewelry, not the clothes, not even the pictures of them together. She left like she'd arrived, with nothing but herself. Now here's where you might think Daniel would move on, marry Victoria, and live happily ever after with his billions. But money can't buy peace of mind. What would you do if you were walking down the aisle towards someone while the person you truly loved sat in the audience? Let me know in the comments, because Daniel's choice is about to shock everyone. The St. Regis Ballroom had been transformed into something out of a fever dream of wealth. 40,000 white orchids imported from Thailand covered every surface. Crystal chandeliers cast light that made the diamonds on wealthy necks spark like captured stars. The aisle was lined with roses so perfect they looked artificial, each one selected by hand, each one costing more than most people spend on groceries in a week. 200 guests sat in gold Chiavari chairs that had been blessed by the same feng shui master who arranged wealthy people's divorce. The combined net worth in that room exceeded the GDP of several small nations. Senators whispered to Supreme Court justices. Tech billionaires sat beside pharmaceutical executives. The mayor was there, along with 3 ambassadors and at least 1 member of actual royalty. The string quartet, flown in from Vienna, began playing Pachelbel's canon, and the mahogany doors opened one final time. Victoria Ashford appeared like a vision designed by committee to be perfect. Her Vera Wang gown had taken 6 months and 40 seamstresses to create, incorporating diamonds from her grandmother's tiara and pearls that had supposedly belonged to Grace Kelly. Her blonde hair was arranged in an architectural marvel that defied both gravity and logic. She moved down the aisle with the kind of practiced grace that comes from a lifetime of cotillion classes and Swiss finishing schools. She was, without question, the most beautiful bride anyone in that room had ever seen, and Daniel felt absolutely nothing. He stood at the altar in his Tom Ford tuxedo, his best man Christopher Langley beside him, and watched this gorgeous woman float toward him while his mind was entirely elsewhere. His face showed the right expression, soft smile, eyes bright with what guests would interpret as love but was actually panic. His hands were steady, his posture perfect. Everything about him screamed successful man about to marry his equal. Inside, he was drowning, because while Victoria approached with measured steps timed to the music, Daniel's peripheral vision had locked onto row 3, where Becca sat between a hedge fund manager's wife and a diplomat from Brazil. She was trying to make herself small, invisible, but to Daniel she might as well have been lit by spotlights. Federal Judge Harrison Montgomery, who owed his appointment to contributions from the Ashford family, began the ceremony with practiced authority. His voice filled the ballroom with words that had been spoken millions of times before, but never quite like this. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of 2 lives, 2 families, 2 futures becoming one. The words washed over Daniel like white noise. His eyes kept drifting to Becca despite his efforts to focus on Victoria. 7 years had changed her in small ways that hit him like punches. Her hair was shorter, a professional bob that replaced the long waves he used to wrap around his fingers. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Laugh lines, which meant someone, somewhere, had been making her happy. She wore a simple, black sheath dress, probably from Nordstrom, maybe Macy's, and yet she made every designer gown in the room look like someone was trying too hard. Daniel and Victoria have chosen to join their lives in the bonds of matrimony, Judge Montgomery continued, his voice carrying the weight of law and tradition. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, honestly, and with full understanding of its sacred obligations. Honestly. The word stuck in Daniel's throat like glass. Victoria reached the altar, her father Anthony placing her hand in Daniel's with the satisfaction of a man completing a particularly profitable merger. Her fingers were cold despite the warm September afternoon. Her smile was perfect. Everything was perfect, except Daniel's heart was hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The couple has chosen traditional vows, the judge announced, which was a lie. Victoria had chosen traditional vows. Daniel had agreed because agreeing was easier than caring. As the judge droned on about love and commitment, about sickness and health, about promises that bind beyond death, Daniel found himself studying Becca with an intensity that bordered on desperate. She was looking down at her hands folded in her lap, probably counting the minutes until she could escape. He noticed she wore no rings. No jewelry at all except small pearl earrings he didn't recognize. 7 years. 7 years of his life spent trying to forget her, to convince himself that choosing money over love was wisdom, not cowardice. 7 years of dating women who looked perfect on his arm but felt like strangers in his bed. 7 years of driving past her apartment at night, of anonymously paying off her student loans through a shell company, of keeping her picture in his desk drawer and telling himself it was just nostalgia. If anyone present, Judge Montgomery's voice cut through Daniel's thoughts, knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. The silence that followed was heavy as gold, thick as honey, long as a lifetime. This was the moment in every wedding where guests shift uncomfortably, maybe cough, perhaps share amused glances at the antiquated tradition. No one ever actually spoke up. It was theater, nothing more. Daniel turned from Victoria to face the congregation. Time stopped. Or maybe it just felt that way when you were about to destroy your entire life in front of everyone who mattered. "I do," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the ballroom like a gunshot. "I have a reason why this wedding shouldn't happen." The gasps came in waves. First from the front rows, Victoria's parents, his mother Eleanor, the wedding party, then spreading backward like dominoes falling through the crowd. Someone dropped a champagne flute. The photographer lowered his camera, unsure whether to keep documenting what was clearly becoming a catastrophe. The string quartet stopped mid-note, bows frozen in air. Victoria's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, her bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands. "Daniel," she whispered, though in the sudden silence it might as well have been a scream. "What are you doing?" But Daniel wasn't looking at her. His eyes had found Becca in the third row, where she sat frozen, her face drained of all color, her hands gripping her clutch like a lifeline. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, though it wasn't clear who he was apologizing to. Victoria, Becca, or the room full of New York's most powerful people watching their carefully constructed world implode. "I thought I could do this. I thought 7 years was enough time to forget, to move on, to convince myself that love could be replaced by logic." Eleanor Rothschild stood up from her front row seat, her face twisted with fury. "Daniel, stop this immediately." "No," he cut her off, something he'd never done before. "I've been stopping for 7 years. I've been the good son, the smart CEO, the perfect groom, but I can't speak vows about love and faithfulness when I'm still in love with someone else." The whispers started like rain, soft at first, then building to a storm. Phones appeared despite the no photography request. Someone was already live tweeting. The New York Post would later call it the wedding meltdown of the century, but in that moment it was just raw, terrible truth spilling out in front of everyone. "I've been in love with Rebecca Moreno every single day for the past 7 years," Daniel continued, his voice stronger now, as if confession gave him power. Even when I was too much of a coward to admit it. Even when I chose money and status over happiness. Even when I let my mother and the board and everyone else convince me that love wasn't enough. Victoria stood at the altar like a statue in Vera Wang, her Harvard law training the only thing keeping her upright. For a moment, just a moment, something human flickered across her face, pain maybe, or recognition. Then her expression hardened into something else entirely. "Daniel, stop," she said, her voice shifting from confused to commanding. "Whatever this is, we can discuss it privately." "Privately?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We've been living privately for 18 months, Victoria. Private dinners for the cameras, private engagement for the investors, private feelings we never actually shared. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time either of us said I love you and meant it?" Victoria Ashford had not graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law by crumbling at the first sign of adversity. She had not become one of Manhattan's most formidable young attorneys by letting men, even billionaire men, humiliate her without consequence. She stood at that altar, designer gown catching the light, and laughed. A sound like crystal breaking. "You think you're the only one with secrets, Daniel?" Her voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made courtrooms tremble. "You think you're the only one who's been pretending?" She reached into her clutch. Custom-made, $30,000, a wedding gift from Hermes, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Since we're being honest," she said, unfolding it with deliberate slowness, "since we're destroying lives with the truth, let me add my own confession." She held up the paper for everyone to see. "This is a pregnancy test, taken 3 days ago. Positive." The gasps grew louder. Daniel's face went white. Anthony Ashford half rose from his seat. "But here's the interesting part, darling," Victoria continued, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "It's not yours." The room erupted, but Victoria wasn't finished. She turned to face the congregation, playing to her audience like the performer she'd always been. "Christopher Langley," she called out, and heads swiveled to find Daniel's best friend and business partner sitting in the second row beside his wife of 5 years, Jennifer. "Stand up. Tell them. Tell everyone how long we've been together." Christopher looked like a man watching his execution approach. Trapped between his sobbing wife and the weight of 200 stairs, he slowly stood. Sweat beaded on his forehead, visible even from the altar. "Victoria, please." 3 years, she announced, her voice cutting through his protest. 3 years of sneaking around, of pretending to help plan this wedding while we planned our own future. I was going to leave Daniel after a respectable year of marriage, long enough to merge the family businesses, to secure the contracts, to make it all look proper. Christopher was going to divorce Jennifer. We'd wait another year, then accidentally find each other. It was all so perfectly planned. Jennifer Langley's scream was primal. She lunged at her husband as he stood there, not even trying to defend himself, just taking the humiliation like a man who knew he deserved worse. This is the moment where everyone in that ballroom realized they were witnessing history, not the fairy tale wedding of the century, but its complete destruction. Have you ever seen someone's perfect life crumble in real time? Share this story if you believe honesty, however painful, is better than living a lie. Because what happened next would destroy not just relationships, but fortunes, reputations, and the very foundation of New York society itself. Security rushed into the ballroom. 3 men in black suits who'd been hired to keep wedding crashers out, not to separate a betrayed wife from her cheating husband. They pulled Jennifer Langley off Christopher, but she kept screaming, her voice raw and broken. 5 years. 5 years of marriage. We have children. We have 2 children. Christopher's face crumpled. Whatever he'd imagined would happen when the truth came out, it wasn't this public demolition of everything he'd built. His wife was being half carried, half dragged toward the exit, still screaming about their daughters, about the house in Greenwich, about the lies she'd been living inside without knowing. Anthony Ashford, Victoria's father, stood up from his seat, his face purple with rage. The real estate mogul who'd built an empire on handshake deals and brutal negotiations looked ready to commit murder in front of federal judges and the mayor. "You've destroyed us," he roared at his daughter. "The merger, the contracts, everything we've built." "Everything you built," Victoria shot back, still standing at the altar like some vengeful goddess in white. "Your empire, your legacy, your deal disguised as my wedding." That's when Eleanor Rothschild fainted. Not delicately, not gracefully, but a complete collapse that sent her crashing into the orchid arrangements. Two doctors from among the guests rushed forward while Daniel stood frozen at the altar, watching his mother crumble just like everything else in his life. But the person he was really watching had started moving. Becca had stood up from her seat in row 3, her black dress a shadow among all the pastels and jewel tones. She was heading for the exit, walking fast but not running, maintaining her dignity even as the world exploded around her. "Becca, wait!" Daniel called out, his voice cracking. He started to move toward her, but Victoria grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging through his tuxedo jacket hard enough to draw blood. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare go after her. You started this. You stood up in front of everyone and confessed your pathetic 7-year obsession, and now you want to run to her? Now?" She was right, and that made it worse. Becca was already at the doors, pushing through them without looking back, leaving Daniel standing there between the woman he'd promised to marry and the chaos he'd created. But Victoria wasn't finished. The Harvard lawyer in her had saved the most devastating evidence for last. "You want to know the really pathetic part?" she said, loud enough for the phone still recording to catch every word. "I knew about her. I've always known." Daniel's shame was a physical thing, weighing him down like stones in his pockets. "The private investigator I hired found everything," Victoria continued, her voice carrying over the chaos of Eleanor being fanned by bridesmaids, of Anthony Ashford being held back by his own brothers, of guests frantically texting and tweeting and calling their drivers. "Every pathetic detail of your obsession." She pulled out her phone. Even her technology was designer, custom encrusted with diamonds, and started reading from what was clearly a report. Subject drives past Rebecca Moreno's apartment an average of 3 times per week, usually between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Subject keeps a photograph of Moreno in his desk drawer at the office, hidden beneath financial documents. Subject used a shell company called PH Holdings to pay off Moreno's student loans in full, $127,000, last year. Subject has saved every text message she ever sent him from 2011 to 2014. Subject regularly donates to the pediatric cancer ward, where Moreno works, always anonymously, always in amounts that end in 143, which apparently was their code for "I love you." Each revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. The room had gone quiet enough to hear his humiliation in high definition. Even the security guards had stopped moving, transfixed by the spectacular destruction playing out before them. "I knew all of it," Victoria said, tears finally breaking through her composure, mascara running in black rivers down her perfect cheeks. "Every drive-by, every donation, every time you looked at her picture when you thought no one was watching. I thought I could make you forget her. I thought if I was perfect enough, beautiful enough, successful enough, you'd finally see me instead of constantly looking for her ghost." She laughed again, that broken crystal sound. "But I was just a placeholder, wasn't I? A 7-year rebound that came with a convenient business merger. Just like you were for Christopher and me. We were all using each other, pretending it was love when it was really just mutual exploitation dressed up in designer clothes. I never meant," Daniel started, but Victoria cut him off. "To hurt me? To waste 18 months of my life? To humiliate me in front of everyone who matters in this city? Which part didn't you mean, Daniel?" The truth was he'd meant none of it and all of it. He'd meant to go through with the wedding, to lock himself into this gilded cage forever. But seeing Becca there, knowing she was watching him promise to love someone else, had broken something inside him that 7 years of careful construction couldn't hold together. "We deserve each other," Victoria said, her voice dropping to something almost gentle. "Both of us standing here in our expensive clothes, surrounded by our expensive friends, having destroyed everything for people who've already walked away. Christopher's probably halfway to his lawyer's office. And your precious Becca? She's gone, Daniel. She walked out those doors, and she's never coming back. We blew up our lives for nothing. The ballroom looked like a war zone. Chairs overturned, orchids crushed underfoot, abandoned champagne glasses and cell phones still recording the aftermath. The string quartet had long since fled. The photographer was still shooting, probably calculating how much he could sell these images for, and at the altar, Daniel Rothschild and Victoria Ashford stood in their wedding finery, surrounded by the wreckage of their own making, finally honest and finally completely alone. By the time the New York Stock Exchange opened Monday morning, the wedding disaster had gone viral. Billionaire's wedding meltdown was trending worldwide. Someone had leaked cell phone footage to TMZ. The New York Post ran a front-page photo of Victoria at the altar, mascara streaming, under the headline, "Pregnant Bride's Revenge." Rothschild biotech stock plummeted 12% in the first hour of trading. By noon, it was down 18%. The board called an emergency meeting. Investors were pulling out. The Japanese pharmaceutical company that had been planning a partnership worth $2 billion officially withdrew their offer, citing concerns about leadership stability. The Ashford-Rothschild merger, which would have created an $8 billion empire combining pharmaceutical innovation with real estate development, died before the lawyers could even file the paperwork. 18 months of negotiations, millions in legal fees, countless strategic dinners and carefully orchestrated meetings, all worthless. Christopher Langley didn't even make it to Monday. The board of his own investment firm, Langley Capital, removed him via emergency vote Sunday night. His partners, men he'd known for 15 years, wouldn't take his calls. His clients, representing $3 billion in managed assets, demanded their money be transferred to other managers immediately. The divorce papers from Jennifer were filed at 8 a.m. Monday morning. Her lawyer, the most ruthless in Connecticut, made it clear she wanted everything. The house in Greenwich, the apartment in the city, the house in the Hamptons, full custody of their daughters, and enough money to ensure those girls never had to see their father again unless they chose to. Meanwhile, Manhattan society was feeding on the scandal like sharks on blood. The Metropolitan Club revoked Daniel's membership. The charity boards that had courted him for donations suddenly found his name toxic. Women who'd spent years trying to get Victoria into their social circles now pretended they'd never met her. The invitation to the Met Gala, which Daniel had received every year since making his first billion, was quietly withdrawn. "Did you hear?" became the opening to every conversation at every private club and exclusive restaurant in the city. The story grew with each telling. Victoria's pregnancy became twins, then triplets. Christopher's affair stretched from 3 years to 5. Some claim Daniel had actually punched Christopher at the altar, though no footage supported this. But while New York's elite gossiped and stockholders panicked, 3 lives were quietly dissolving in different directions. Daniel spent 3 weeks looking for Becca. She'd taken leave from the hospital the day after the wedding. Her apartment in Brooklyn sat dark, mail piling up. Her phone was disconnected. Her sister in New Jersey wouldn't answer the door. When he finally tracked her down to her sister's house in Newark, he stood on the front steps with flowers, white roses, because he remembered she'd loved them, not red ones like everyone assumed, and rang the doorbell for 10 minutes straight. "Go away, Daniel." Her voice finally came through the intercom, tired and flat. "Please, just let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you humiliated me in front of 200 people. How you used your wedding to another woman to make some grand gesture. Or how you think that after 7 years of nothing you can just show up and I'll fall into your arms." "I love you," he said, the words he should have said 7 years ago. "You don't get to do this," she replied, and even through the crackly speaker he could hear the tears she was fighting. "You don't get to blow up your life and expect me to be your salvation." "I'm not your backup plan, Daniel. I'm not your safety net when your perfect world falls apart. You were never a backup plan. You were the plan. I just lost my way. For 7 years? You lost your way for 7 years?" Her laugh was bitter static through the speaker. No, Daniel, you made a choice. You chose money and status and fitting in over us. And now that those things have blown up in your face, you want to come back? That's not love. That's cowardice. She was right. He'd been a coward then, and he was being a coward now, looking for her to save him from the consequences of his own choices. 2 months later, Becca moved to Seattle. She'd been offered a position at Children's Hospital years earlier, but had turned it down to stay near Daniel. The irony wasn't lost on her. She threw herself into work, into saving children's lives, into anything that kept her mind off that terrible day at the St. Regis. She dated occasionally, a pediatric surgeon who made her laugh, a software developer who brought her coffee during long shifts, a fellow nurse who understood the demands of the job. But comparisons were inevitable. They weren't Daniel. But then again, maybe the Daniel she'd loved had never really existed. Maybe he'd always been the man who would choose money over love, who would propose to one woman while carrying a torch for another, who would detonate his life rather than live with his choices. Victoria never returned to New York. Her father cut her off completely, the family name too damaged by the scandal. The pregnancy, if it had ever been real, was never mentioned again. Some said she'd lost the baby from stress. Others whispered about a quiet procedure in Switzerland. The truth vanished with Victoria herself. She started over in London, using her law degree to work for a small firm specializing in divorce proceedings. She became an expert in the ways love could turn to hatred, in the careful division of assets and affections, in the bloodless dissection of relationships that had once promised forever. Christopher Langley disappeared entirely. The divorce cost him $50 million and his daughters. Jennifer made sure of that. His attempts to rebuild his career failed. No firm would touch him. Last anyone heard, he was living in Singapore, managing a small fund, drinking too much, calling his daughters on weekends when Jennifer allowed it, which wasn't often. 3 lives that had collided so spectacularly at the St. Regis were now scattered across the globe, each nursing wounds that would never fully heal, each learning that some mistakes can't be undone. Some words can't be unsaid, and some loves, once broken, can't be repaired with all the money in the world. 5 years after the wedding that destroyed 3 lives, a journalist doing a retrospective on the scandal managed to interview all 3 principal players separately. The resulting article, Love Lies in Billions, the real story of the Rothschild-Ashford wedding, won a Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Daniel, by then running a small biotech startup focused on affordable medications for developing nations, a far cry from his empire days, reflected on what he'd learned. I thought money could buy me the right to be a coward. I thought success meant I could have everything without choosing anything. But love doesn't work that way. Love demands courage, and I didn't have it when it mattered. He lives alone now in a modest apartment in Queens, not far from where he grew up. He never married. Sometimes he walks by the hospital where Becca used to work, but he never goes in. Becca, still in Seattle, still saving lives, still unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, was philosophical. People think this is a story about choosing love over money, but it's not. It's about the price of dishonesty, with others but mostly with yourself. Daniel, Victoria, Christopher, we all lied to ourselves about what we really wanted, and the explosion was inevitable. Victoria, speaking from her London office where she now helps others navigate the wreckage of failed marriages, was perhaps the most insightful. We were all victims and villains in our own story. Daniel loved someone else but chose security. I knew I was second choice but thought I could change him. Christopher and I found real connection but built it on betrayal. The wedding didn't destroy our lives, it just revealed they were already broken. The truth about the Rothschild-Ashford wedding isn't that it was unique, it's that it was inevitable. When you build relationships on foundations of deception, when you choose safety over authenticity, when you treat hearts like commodities to be traded, the only question isn't if everything will fall apart, but when and how spectacular the collapse will be. Somewhere in Manhattan right now, in another expensive ballroom, another couple is walking down another aisle for the wrong reasons, convinced their story will be different, that their lies won't catch up to them, that love can be negotiated like a business deal. They're wrong. If this story made you think about the importance of being honest in your own relationships, hit subscribe for more extraordinary stories that reveal the truth about love, money, and the choices that define us. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, it's better to be alone with your truth than together with a lie, because in the end, the most expensive wedding in New York history cost far more than money. It cost 3 people the chance at real love, real connection, real happiness. And that's a price no amount of billions can ever buy back.